Hello. This is take two of recording this video because I recorded it the first time and I realized that it was kind of all over the place. I didn't structure it as well as I had hoped. So I went back to the drawing board. I took notes, so I'm going to be reading partially off of my phone here because these are just initial thoughts that I have on punishment. Well, I don't want to say initial. This is like a first draft because I've definitely given it a lot of thought and I've tried to piece punishment into the larger network of ideas that I'm going after here as far as political philosophy. But I think that punishment is something that is far more important to understand than a lot of people would normally give it credit for. So I'm going to organize this better at some point, but I do want to say that if you leave a comment on this video, by all means, try to make it constructive and something that's, beneficial. Because I'm going to read the comments on this video, just like I do all the comments on the Ben Shields channel. On the right media, I don't always get the opportunity because there's so many, but on this channel, there's only, I think, 550, 560 subs. So that makes it very manageable. So I'm going to go through this a bit. I'm just going to blast out some of these ideas and over the course of time, refine them down. The more that I read, the more that I write, the more that I'm able to think about these things. So I think that my problem, and I'll just lay this out right at the beginning, I think my problem with punishment is that when you punish somebody, it implants the idea in their head that they can then punish somebody else, and then they look for, well, what was the criteria that somebody used to punish me? And it was that somebody fit them into their own little moral box. And I'm not talking about when somebody aggresses against somebody else and then that person faces repercussions for their actions. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about actively going out and aggressing against somebody because you think that they did not receive enough punishment for stepping outside of a box that you put them in. And this is like what we see with vice crimes like gambling, prostitution. What's the other one? There's three of them, three big ones. Gambling, prostitution, and I'll think of it at some point. Oh, and drug use. Drug use is the other one, where it only hurts the people who are doing it. So, and the people in their network, which means that it's useful for you to take into account the people that are in your social network and the people that affect you. Because if somebody is allowing themselves to deteriorate, you should remove them from your life because that will in turn start to deteriorate you in one form or another. And so when you look at punishment, people try to look at a reason that somebody has punished them, and then they'll use that as a springboard to punish others. So when they look at responsibility that's shouldered on them, that that they don't willingly take on themselves, but somebody else puts it on them, they then try to do that to other people for the sake of being able to exert punishment over other people. And this comes down to something I'm going to describe here as I go through my own personal history with punishment and what led me to a lot of this understanding that I have. It is you really get into the nitty-gritty of what exactly people are trying to do when they exert a punishment on somebody else. And it's that mindset that I think that's foundational to the idea that government is a necessity, because so many people go through their life fitting into other people's moral boxes of conformity. And I think that that is a crucial issue that people have to deal with that is not given its proper dues in the sphere of conversation that we have nowadays. And the problem fundamentally with punishment is that it's generally a positive aggression. So you have to go out of your way to aggress against somebody because they're not fitting into the box that you think they should be fitting into. And the issue with that is that it steps you outside of the bounds of you being an individual, and it now means that you're imparting your force on somebody else. So what I mean specifically by this is that if you go to the store and they're charging exorbitant prices for something, you don't have to buy the good, but by you not buying the good, you're not aggressing against the store. If you stole from them, then that would be a positive aggression. You'd be aggressing against them. But to just not interact with them is perfectly viable, and it's not punishment. That's not aggression. That's just you voluntarily choosing to go spend your money somewhere else. And so I guess if you wanted to get into the technicals of this, I would call it positive punishment, like punishment that's imparted on somebody. Because I guess technically you could call walking out of a store because of high prices a punishment to the store, but I wouldn't call it that. But again, that's all just definitional. So it's also important to recognize that there are hierarchies of competence that arise naturally in the world. So let's say that there's somebody who's been a teacher for 40 years and somebody who's been a teacher for 2 years. The person who's been a teacher for 40 years can likely give advice to the person who's been a teacher for 2 years. Does it mean that they have a right to punish them? No, it's not what it means at all. But it does mean that there are instances where you should defer to somebody who perhaps knows more in a certain area than yourself. And this doesn't mean that you just take it as being the 100% absolute truth, but it does mean that you should internalize it with the idea that the person who implanted that idea in you perhaps knows more than you do about a certain topic or a certain area. And so this is where we start to see the real issues of punishment take root, because you have people who we assume know what's best that really don't know what's best. We assume that the politician that's voted in by the people is what's best for the people. But the masses are horrible at knowing what's best for the masses, at knowing what's best for a functioning country, for a sustainable culture. The masses are horrendous at that. And that's partially why, I'm not saying we have democracy in the US, but that's partially why democracy fails so hard, is because it's just, it's two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner. So let's go through a bit of my history with punishment and what led me to, I don't want to say what led me to think the way that I do about it, but what allowed me to go into my history and extrapolate what I had internalized regarding punishment. Because I think that the way that I'm going about it is very helpful, because it's like when you go to psychologically analyze somebody, you can't go into the interaction trying to psychologically analyze them, because it will leave gaps in your analysis. It'll be very coarse and awkward. And it's not a suitable way to analyze somebody, because your mindset going into it is different than it would naturally be if you weren't trying to analyze them. And I think that's a benefit that I have going through my thoughts with punishment right now, is that a lot of it is a post-mortem kind of analysis, where I didn't think through punishment at the time that this was happening. This is something I've only started to think more about the more that I've gotten into political philosophy. So, my history with punishment. I was always scared into conformity with teachers, police officers, anyone seen as above me. And this goes back to the hierarchies that I was talking about, where I figured, well, if I'm in school, the teachers, they know what's best. They have their ironclad laws in school. I should just follow them, listen to whatever they say. They clearly have to be well educated to educate me. And that's something I've since realized is not true, because I have I have the video, 14 Years a Prisoner, which I'll put up on the screen here, and it's down in the description. So if you want to watch that, you can get more of my thoughts on public education. But I was always scared into conformity with teachers, and police officers were the big ones. And I never had confrontations with police officers, but it's the kind of thing where, you're taught as you're growing up, like, hey, police officers are here to help you. You just need to just surrender all your will to them and obey them and do what they say. And while that's somewhat true, I don't think that it's entirely true because we see plenty of abuses of power by police, and we see that they're really just an arm of the state. They're the state's defense for domestic threats to the state, which is why I had a tweet that I'll put up on the screen here for a second, and it says a lot about the way that the branches of the state operate. Now, when we're talking about these people that I feared punishment from, there's two sides to that. There is not just the fear of punishment, fear of nonconformity to their box, but there is also a certain amount of reverence because you have to place them on a hierarchy above you. And so you see this reverence combined with a fear of nonconformity. But it's funny that as a kid, you never notice the root of that fear. You never notice the root of that conformity because I had the reverence for politicians, but I never had the fear of politicians. I never saw the state as being tied into the police or the state as being tied into education until I, of course, proactively tried to learn about this stuff on my own. So politicians often got the reverence without the fear to conform, but that's only because their type of destruction is hidden from the youth. And in many cases, the youth are targeted by the state. Look at public education, kids shows on public television. You have medical mandates. You have, and this is a big one, the propping up of unsustainable instincts in adults that inevitably get passed on to their children. So you have these dysfunctional instincts that are just compounded because you have entire generations, you have entire lineages propped up on just the state, on just the state's safety net. So the state does not serve to turn people into functional beings. It just ameliorates their fears and allows them to keep on living while the state righteously steals from other people. And of course, I don't actually mean that it's righteous. I just mean the statist's mentality is that it's righteous. So I grew up, though, and I valued certain things. And I think that these are important to point out because while you are in several different hierarchies, that you can fractionate the world into an infinite amount of hierarchies, but there are values that you hold foundational to your being, and these values are the ones that sort of shape your fear in general towards certain people and certain professions, certain groups, whatever. And that's why I want to go through some of the things that I think established my hierarchy growing up and how exactly that was used to twist my view of who I should be listening to and who I shouldn't be. So the things that I valued growing up, which I still value in many ways to this day, are success, decisiveness, productivity, and moral rigidity. Now, when I say moral rigidity, I'm specifically talking about people not being hypocrites, people doing what they say. And of course, decisiveness becomes very easy when you're morally rigid because you're sure of your instincts. But this also goes back a bit, I think, to something that Nietzsche was talking about with his moral imperative, where he said that the moral imperative is not sticking to a single, there isn't a written set of a moral code that you should follow, but the idea is that you should follow one moral code. You set your morality and then you stick to it. You don't deviate from it because otherwise you're just wandering endlessly, and it's like a car with a stone on the gas pedal and no steering wheel. So like I said, I proactively discovered state corruption, state inefficiency, state incompetence, and I proactively learned about the conceptual functions of free market capitalism. And I was able to put the pieces in place to see how punishment in your childhood leads to a veil over your eyes where you think that you need government all the time. You think that the world could not function without government. These are the people who go, well, who would build the roads? And it's like, well, who builds the roads now? The state just funds them. They don't build them. You don't have the elected politicians going out and laying down the asphalt. And so I wrote a little excerpt here just to make sure that this is all in like a very linear ABCD kind of format. And I want to go through this a bit, and I'll make addendums where I think is necessary. I never peacefully accepted punishments brought upon me for simply engaging in actions that only would conceivably harm me. To punish is a means to either one of two ends. If I recognize it as an offense worth recognizing was wrong, and I accept that I should have acted differently, then punishment would only serve to either quell anger in the punisher or exercise power to scare others into form. This is often easy to differentiate based on the setting of the punishment. If it's privately, then it's more to quell the anger in the punisher, whereas if it's publicly done, then it's more to exercise power to scare others into form. So this will serve to over-punish. And the reason that I say that, I don't think I elaborate more here, I might, but the reason that I say that it's over-punishing is that you're imparting an effect on the person that wouldn't just naturally occur to them based on the actions that they took. So it's like if you, like, let's say you just go into school and you slap somebody. Well, that person's not going to talk to you. They're going to tell other people what you did, and other people aren't going to want to hang out with you if you're just randomly slapping people. And your social network is going to be very difficult to build. You're not going to be able to pull on as many resources. It's like this is the kind of train of thought that you have to go down, and this is the kind of train of thought that's not taught in public education. So if over-punished, I would experience more of a negative effect from what I believed to be an incorrect action than would have naturally been imparted, basically what I just said. And this will make some individuals into cowards, afraid of stepping outside a box they can designate as safe. It depends the degree to which they were punished by human subjectivity and the strength of various instincts in the psyche. However, if I feel there was no incorrect action, then any punishment will make no sense to me and will only serve to potentially breed either conformity to authority, serving to tame, or a virulent hatred for authority that can manifest as a dogma, damning one to consistently resist order because all order is seen as being crafted by some authority. In our postmodern age, we can often see reality become subjective as one turns the tyranny on nature. And to just elaborate a little bit more on this last bit here, because I didn't do it here. So when I talk about conforming to authority, it's like going back to the hierarchies again, okay? There are some instances where you should somewhat defer to somebody else who perhaps knows more about a certain area than you, or you think would have reason to know more about something than you. But again, you use them as a leader. You use them as somebody who lays out information and you voluntarily take what you want. A ruler punishes you. A ruler says, no, you have to do what I'm saying, or I'm going to aggress against you. And when I bring up the postmodernism, how this resistance to order has manifested in postmodernism as just a subjective reality, I guess the better way to word that is that it's more of a subjective view of what absolute truth is, where there isn't an absolute truth, but it's just whatever climbs you up the dominance hierarchy. Because again, the postmodernists, they reduce all human action down to the will to power, which Nietzsche says is the fundamental will of people, but at the same time, it's defined in a very specific way by Nietzsche, and the postmodernists don't define it that way. They define it as just a game of domination, as like force. So you use force to climb up the dominance hierarchy. So you can aggress against other people, and that's completely fine. And there is no realm of good or evil. There is just the person acting is always in the realm of good, and anything that doesn't help them attain the next level of the hierarchy that they're trying to get to is just evil. And so this is where we see a subjective reality, where it's really a subjective view of truth. And it's more like Well, morality doesn't actually exist, which is true, but in relation to truth, it does. And so we see that people try to tyrannize over nature by assuming that people are just these malleable pieces of Play-Doh that can be sculpted into whatever people want. And I think I do get into that a little bit more here, so I'll continue on. Postmodernism, and by nature of that materialism and nihilism, directs its anger at the class hierarchy because they don't think it's something that naturally manifests. The problem is that it does naturally manifest, and they end up being a tyrant against the reality that is the nature of living beings. This nature of living beings is not arbitrary. Life sprouts, grows, adapts, and dies all within the bounds of the natural world. The natural world shapes all living beings, and the very essence of life being a limited endeavor means that over time, species will become as efficient, adaptable, and productive as possible, dedicating only to each what would most aptly serve the furtherance of life. When the average person is not understanding the world to that depth and seeing the full breadth of how natural laws shape living beings, the line between a living being's subjective valuation and ironclad natural law starts to blur. This means that the concept of life is removed from any natural setting and instead can be viewed as its own world existing within the species, where all instincts can be expropriated and any can be implanted no matter how violently. This is where I'm talking about the Play-Doh example, where it's entirely shaped by human hands, where that's how they think of people. And that's fundamentally wrong. This is where we can see the primary difference between anarcho-capitalism and authoritarianism. Anarcho-capitalists recognize that you can never escape natural law, and it's best for life to be formed by forces of nature rather than forces of man. Tyrants and their supporters assume it to be best for man to tyrannize over all because they seek to shape man just as nature has. But nature is everywhere all at once. Man is limited beyond his knowledge. Life also feels nature's hands caress the malleable being, prompting adaptation to the new pressures, while man's valuation and abilities provides an unstable footing for interpretations of sensory input, thus making man an unreliable disseminator of what would serve life best. Life also interacts with the external world, of course, so how adaptable a being is provides an indication of their longevity as a species. This would mean that species are defined by the degree of similarity among their instincts, both in character and stamina. And the human subjectivity that free markets function on is choice uncoerced by man's force. Lack of human-initiated force allows human valuation to be based on nature as opposed to another man's subjective decrees. You can think of capitalism as being directly tied to natural law, while authoritarianism is at least 1 degree removed from nature, although for it to manifest into a government structure, it would necessarily be several more degrees than just 1, which means that the dysfunction is compounded. When life is shaped by natural law, it is a singular set of principles that imparts equal forces on everyone in equal circumstances. This means the carving of an individual's instincts are, on average, directed towards the single goal of furthering life. When human subjectivity controls the forces that shape people, the direction is constantly shifting, and as I already said, even if it was consistent, it would be impossible for man to be a better carver of man than natural law, because we don't interpret sensory input from an objective standpoint. It's subjective. So that was long-winded, I know, but the point was basically how the current mainstream mindset views mankind is deteriorating the foundation of what progressed mankind to this point. How punishment is conceived of is a crucial step to breaking down the mindset that we need rulers and that we can justly rule over other people. And this view is primarily shaped in our childhood. The first instinct, usually inhabiting a mind that cannot operate without external frame and content, is the instinct to remain in the box others have put us in. So now I'm talking about the two places that you can go with punishment, basically. So the first place you can go is the instinct to remain in the box that others have put us in because it feels safe. We justify being there for safety's sake, which drives man to accept that which deteriorates him or serves to tame him and weaken him and make him sick and docile. Because weakness comes most easily to the man who's already weak, just as freedom is traded for safety by the man who forgets what freedom tastes like. The second instinct that could be present, usually inhabiting an individual who feels within his being an instinct to true freedom, drives a man to rebel against walls he feels others are putting around him. This man still retains the strength to push back without fracturing. And punishment is also different from restraint, okay? So like when it comes to children, you think, well, if my child's acting up, what do I do about it? Like, how do I keep them from doing things that are hurting themselves? Because obviously, a 3-year-old could spill a glass of milk and they're not going to learn that they shouldn't be drinking out of a glass maybe because they can't hold on to the glass, or it's like a 3-year-old's brain doesn't operate that way. So you restrain them from hurting themselves. You could almost call it like a negative action where you're keeping them from doing something harmful instead of harming them for doing something harmful. And this is also where, if the kid sticks a fork in an electrical outlet, it's like, well, maybe you should have covered the electrical outlets. Maybe you shouldn't have had forks within their reach. Maybe you shouldn't have had metal things within their reach. And of course, the more obvious solution to that problem is just put covers over the outlets. It's not, hide silverware from your 3-year-old. That's a bit extreme, but put covers over the outlets. Make it so that they can't get to them, Like a lot of the times that parents go to punish children, it's the parents' fault that they're in that situation in the first place. So punishment is different from restraint. You restrain a child because their cognitive skills are not sufficient to act in all realms of life. You restrain them from injuring themselves or others. You explain to them how they could have hurt themselves or others if they're of age to understand it, and you allow them to learn. Punishment can alter behavior more reliably in the short term, but the long-term negatives need to be considered. Essentially, the long-term negative being a desire to punish others and thinking that you need government. There are enough problems in the world because people don't think long-term. Literally watch any of my videos on the right media on economics and you'll understand exactly what I mean. When a child suffers at the hands of their own bad decision, whether it be immediate or in relation to their social network, as I described earlier with the school example where you go into school and you just slap somebody, they learn all they need to from the interaction. The most an adult should do is explain why the child feels a certain way about an interaction or an event. And keep in mind with all of this too, the parents need to be imparting proper moral values in the household. Values of, I think I put down here, it's self-responsibility, self-preservation, good diet, physical and emotional strength. And these are also things that children will pick up on over the years. But again, explain these things to them. Don't preach to them. Don't try to put them into your box, but get them to build their own walls. Get them to build a box that they feel suitable sitting in. And when I say this, what I mean is I'm not going to go out and buy crystal meth, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that if somebody tells you that you should never drink any alcohol, it doesn't mean that you can't have a drink here or there. But you build walls up around yourself because it's the fear of internal guilt. It's not somebody else imparting responsibility on you. And those are two different things. And it's a very crucial dichotomy to understand. Internal guilt and having responsibility externally imparted on you are two different things. They're two different means to the same end, basically. Again, we get back to the leaders and rulers dichotomy, where you voluntarily take on what the leader says, and the ruler imposes his will on you. So preaching imparts responsibility, which means that preaching is for the sake of punishing, because imparting responsibility is done with the end goal of being capable of punishment if the individual steps out of line. And I think that the current understanding of punishment drives the belief that a fear can be quelled by government. There's a reason that punishment works sometimes and other times it doesn't. One time, the person truly understands the error of their ways and changes their behavior. Punishment isn't needed here. Other times, the individual does not understand the error of their ways, and the effect of moral preachers is fleeting. In both cases, punishment serves to frighten as opposed to explain. And in both cases, the idea that reality is subject to man's force reigns supreme. And often when you impart responsibility on somebody else, or you tell somebody else that they're responsible for something, you don't think of it that way, where you're tyrannizing over nature. But in a way you are, because you're saying that you know what the ironclad moral laws of nature are, which there aren't any, but you're saying that you know what they are, and this other person has to conform to the box that you're putting around them. And the problem with that is that that has extended into an entire ideology, which is postmodernism. It is nihilism, materialism. It's this idea that truth is subjective and it can just be whatever you want. And that's absolutely a remarkably detrimental way to view the world. So I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, this was just, like I said before, a fraction of a larger network of ideas that I'm working on. And I don't know, I'm not going to drag this on too long. I pretty much said everything I want to say. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Be sure to leave constructive comments, and I'll see you guys in the next one.